Hello, my name is Brian Cronin and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this tutorial, Drafting EQE Paper A. The tutorial is in three parts and is based on the EQE 2014 Paper A Electricity Mechanics. This is part 3 of the tutorial, the end product and comments. Let's catch up on what we already did in part 1 and part 2. So as I mentioned, tutorial is based on the 2014 EQE Paper A, Electrical Mechanical. I'm assuming that you have already followed part 1 of the tutorial, the assimilation of information, and part 2, organization and planning. If not, I suggest that you go back and do these. In part 1, we made ourselves familiar with the Nutcracker terminology and made a preliminary purposeful reading to identify facts that could be useful for our end products, which are a main claim, a set of dependent claims, and an introduction to the description. In part 2 of the tutorial, we organized and planned the facts in view of these end products. We planned, in fact, a draft main claim to be rewritten with reference signs and possible with final corrections. We also prepared a draft set of claims to be corrected and rewritten, and we prepared a votum for grant notes, which was an outline for the introduction to the description. What now is the task ahead? We have to finalize the wording of the main claim that evolved through several drafts already. We have to develop a set of claims from our note form plan in finalized form. And we have to write the introduction to the description based on our choice of closest prior art and the perceived problem and the claim solution, using our votum for grant notes by bulking out these notes. In addition, in part 3, we will comment on the end product and also on the examiner's report. So here is the pre-characterizing part of my draft claim as it finished up in part 2, and I've added reference signs. Let's have a look at the claim. I'll read through it. We can read through it together. A nutcracker comprising two support members, 1, 2, of a stiff material connected in spaced relationship by at least 3 elongated connecting elements, 3, 4, 5, 3, 4, 5, 6, that are also of a stiff material and are narrow compared to the support members 1, 2. At least one of the support members 1, 2 being movable relative to the other support member, the two support members 1, 2 facing one another, at least when the support members are in a rest position of the nutcracker. The elongated connecting elements 3, 4, 5, 3, 4, 5, 6 being attached to each support member 1, 2, so the elongated connecting elements are spaced apart from one another between the support members and distributed around a space for receiving a nut. And I have deleted the final words which I found were obsolete, defined between the support members and so on. Those are the last words which I have crossed out. So in this version of the claim, prepared to the previous one, I have added reference signs. You may find it convenient to add reference signs at about the same stage or possibly an earlier stage if you find that convenient. However, you should note that the total absence of reference signs loses only 2 marks. Also, I left in the stiff feature that I was debating to leave out, and also the narrow wording which I was debating to leave out. The part in heavier typeface towards the end of the claim was amended following the novelty check to distinguish over D1, where the connecting elements are not distributed around a nut receiving space, in any event, not completely around a nut receiving space. The words in strike through were deleted at the last moment as redundant, as I mentioned. So you, like me, could take the opportunity to further revise your claim at the writing up stage to try and improve it for handing in. Next, we'll go to the claims characterizing part. The characterizing part on this slide is a first written version that corresponds to the last draft at the planning stage, but which I have rewritten during the final write-up, and the rewritten version will be presented on the next slide. So here is the characterizing part as it ended up last time, characterized in that each elongated connecting element 345, 3456 is pivotally attached to the support members 1, 2, and the support members 1, 2 are movable relative to one another while being maintained by the elongated connecting elements 345, 3456 in a spaced-apart relationship relative to one another, such that movement of the support members 1, 2 away from said rest position causes a relative movement between the elongated connecting elements 3456, 345, 3456 to progressively restrict said space for receiving a nut. Now, in rewriting this up, it seemed to me that the wording was a bit awkward. The maintain spaced apart feature is not a result of the relative movement, and it could come before the pivotal attachment. In D2, the support members are movable relative to one another while being maintained by the elongated connecting elements in a spaced-apart relationship, although in that case the spacing is variable. So I still have an opportunity to revise the characterizing part. I'm going to do it, and you may want to do the same for your claim. Here now is the revised version of my characterizing clause. Characterized in that the two support members 1, 2 are maintained spaced apart from one another by being pivotally attached to spaced apart parts of each elongated connecting element 345, 3456, such that movement of at least one support member 1, 2 away from said rest position causes a relative movement between the elongated connecting elements 345, 3456 to progressively restrict said space for receiving a nut. Now, it seems to me that that's an improvement. Note that the pivotally attached to spaced apart parts of each elongated connecting element comes from the fact that the pivotal connection is not necessarily at the ends of the connecting elements. So the pivotal connection could be somewhere short of the ends. The claim seems to be satisfactory at this stage, but could be further revised when writing dependent claims and the introduction. So we'll leave aside the main claim now, and we'll go ahead with the dependent claims. But first, we will consider the claim in the form that it is now to see whether it meets up to the requirements for acceptable scope that we discussed in part 2 of the tutorial. Here now is the main claim, which we've just seen, the pre-characterizing part and the characterizing part, to which I have added a few touches. Let's read the claim again. It may be repetitive, but we'll see what it is. A nutcracker comprising two support members of a stiff material connected in spaced relationship by at least three elongated connecting elements that are also of stiff material and are narrow compared to the support members. That hasn't changed. At least one of the support members being movable relative to the other support member, the two support members facing one another, at least when the support members are in a rest position of the Nutcracker. That hasn't changed either. And then the next clause is the elongated connecting elements being attached to each support member. So the elongated connecting elements are spaced apart laterally. I've added the word laterally from one another between the support members, and I've added the word are distributed around a space for receiving a nut. The reason for putting in the word laterally was for clarity, and we have in the characterizing clause there are two spaced aparts in different contexts. So I thought it was good to specify how they are spaced apart in the pre-characterizing part. For clarity, I will talk about it later, but I have the impression that in the EQE, clarity is judged on a sliding scale going from slightly unclear to totally obscure. So the loss you encounter depends on how unclear your wording is. And the other point I'd like to make here now is I've been making some last-minute corrections, and you may do the same in the EQE, in the actual exam, but just be very careful, because making a last-minute correction just before handing in the claim could be disastrous if you make the claim worse instead of making it better. So you have to be very careful when you're making last-minute adjustments. Let's now examine how the claim compares to the requirements for acceptable scope we saw in part 2. Here now is a checklist of things that we need to check. How does the claim fare? Does it cover all of the client's described embodiments? And I think it does cover all of the client's described embodiments. Does it cover all variations or modifications described by the client? And there again, I think it covers all of the described variations and modifications covered by the clients. Does it eliminate any useful aspect? It certainly eliminates a certain number of pretty useless aspects, but I don't think it excludes from the scope any useful protection. Is it novel? We made a novelty check, and the novelty check stands good, so hopefully it's novel. Is it inventive? Does it solve a problem in an obvious way? We'll see more on that when we discuss the introduction and we do the problem and solution analysis. Is it clear? Does it clearly delineate the scope of the invention? I think it's clear. Does it meet up to all of the formal requirements? Yes, I think it meets up to the formal requirements, such as the proper division of a two-part claim and the insertion of reference numerals. So hopefully my claim meets up to the requirements, so the claim should be okay, even though it may lose some credit for the multiplicity of small limitations and its lack of conciseness. Now, at this stage, I would ask you, if you have your claim already down on paper, you should test whether your own claim meets up to the requirements that we've just run through. It's much better to do this test yourself, and especially during the exam, before handing in your claim, rather than to hand in a claim and wait for a poor mark and do a post-mortem on the poor mark of the claim. So next we turn to the finalized version of the dependent claims. Here we have, I've written the claims down now in full except for claim 1, which has not been repeated, and we're going to run down through the claims, discussing them and adding comments from the right-hand column. So claim 2 would be the Nutcracker according to claim 1, wherein the connecting elements are rods or tubes. And there again, we could have specified straight or curved rods or tubes, but that's not necessary. It's not, in my opinion, worth making separate subclaim for rods and a separate subclaim for tubes. We go to claim 3, which reads, the Nutcracker according to claim 1 or 2, wherein the support members are plates 1, 2, or massive bodies, in particular cubes. Note that in my draft claim I had cubes, and I've now generalized this to massive bodies. In particular wording, you have to be very careful with this in the EQE, because as a general rule, the EQE examiners do not like non-limiting wording like in particular or such as or for example, but I think their objection refers mainly to claim 1, and I think that in the context of here we have claim 3, we have in particular, this would pass as being a reasonable compromise of saying that, because we don't have the possibility to write too many subclaims. So we go to claim 4. Claim 4 reads, the Nutcracker according to any preceding claim, wherein at least one support member 1, 2 has a through hole for introducing a nut into said space. There again, in figure 1 embodiment, the client's figure 1 embodiment, there were through holes in the two ends of the two plates, but it's quite clear that it's only necessary to have one through hole for introducing the nut. So it's proper to claim just a through hole in at least one support member or at least one support member. We go now to the next sheet, which takes us to claim 5. Claim 5 is the Nutcracker according to any preceding claim, wherein there is a gap between at least two connecting elements, 3, 4, 5, 3, 4, for introducing a nut into said space when the Nutcracker is in the rest position. Note that I finally corrected the space between at least two connecting elements to a gap between two connecting elements. Firstly, it complies with the client's terminology, and secondly, it avoids confusion between the space for the nut. So there was a correction occurred during the writing up of claim 5. Then we go to claim 6. The Nutcracker according to any preceding claim, wherein at least one support member 1, 2 has a handle that forms a lever. Now, the client's figure 6 has two levers, one on each support member. Obviously, that has to be generalized to one or at least one support, at least one handle, and we've put in the function of the handle that it forms a lever, and that is based on the client's wording. We jump now to claim 7. The Nutcracker according to any preceding claim, wherein the number of connecting elements is 3, 4, 3, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 5. Now, first thing to note is that I have rephrased the draft claim wording. The original claim wording was wherein there are 5 or so many connecting elements, and that does not exclude 6 or 7 or 8, whereas wherein the number of connecting elements is 3, 4, or 5 does exclude 6 connecting elements. So the claim has been definitely limited. Now, whether or not it's useful to claim 3, 4, or 5, 3, because 3 are already in claim 1, at least 3, and so on. My reasoning is that by claiming 3, 4, or 5, I cover more embodiments in the claim, and I exclude the useless embodiment of 6 connecting elements. However, I'm not sure whether the examiners will see what I meant. They have no way of reading my mind. They only mark according to the claim that is put down, and I fear that perhaps they will not give top marks to that claim because it claims 3 as well as 4 or 5 connecting elements. We turn over the page now and we come to Claim 8. Claim 8 is the Nutcracker according to any preceding claim, wherein the connecting elements are provided on their surfaces with ridges, protrusions, or non-slip paint. Note that I forgot to put in the reference signs for the connecting elements in this claim. I don't think that's going to be a terrible penalty. Note that I have used the word provided on their surface. It could just be provided with, or they could comprise ridges, protrusions, or non-slip paint. I think you have a wide choice of the way you formulate this particular claim. So we go then to Claim 9. The Nutcracker according to any preceding. Whoops, I forgot the word claim. There again, that's an easy thing to correct. And if the set of claims is well presented, such a small error will not be greatly penalized. Whereas if the set of claims is a very scrappy and disorganized set of claims, that will just add to the disorder and will lead to a loss of marks. Note that claiming that the connecting elements are of the same length implies, by the principle of claim differentiation, that the connecting elements of unequal length are covered by the preceding claims, and notably by Claim 1. Good. Then we pass to Claim 10. Claim 10 is the Nutcracker according to any preceding claim, wherein the connecting elements 345, 3456 are connected at their ends to the support members. This claim is limited to the described embodiments, and it excludes the variations described by the examiner. Furthermore, the claim distinguishes further over D2, where the connecting elements are not connected at their ends to the support members, and therefore it appropriately limits the protection. That's on Claim 10, and then we'll go over the next page where we'll find Claim 11. Claim 11 is a Nutcracker according to any preceding claim, wherein at least one of the support members is rotatable relative to the other. Note that the wording of this claim changed from the previous draft, where I was talking about relative movement of the support members is torsional. So firstly, the draft was in terms of operational language, and torsional is probably okay, but I've replaced it by rotatable, which is more compatible with the client's wording. But the at least one member being rotatable is better than saying relative movement is torsional. So I took the opportunity once again to improve the claim during the last write-up. There we have now Claim 12, the Nutcracker according to any preceding claim, wherein the connecting elements 3, 4, 5 are connected to the support members 1, 2 by ball joints 13, 14, 15, 23, 24, 25, and I would say that ball joints is an obvious choice for a dependent claim. Ball joints covers the client's first embodiment and of course excludes the second embodiment. Claim 13 now reads the Nutcracker according to any one of claims 1 to 10, that is not according to Claim 11 and so on, wherein the support members are movable relative to one another by a sideways translation. And once again, I took the opportunity to go away from the wording, the movement wording. Relative movement is sideways translation, is now movable relative to one another, which is better claim wording for a device. So by a sideways translation. we're coming up to near the end of our set of claims. It's claim 14. We have claim 14 at the top. The Nutcracker according to claim 13, wherein the connecting elements 3, 4, 5, 6 are connected to the support members 1, 2 by hinges 13, 14, 15, 16, 23, 24, 25, 26. And there again, hinges is an obvious choice for a dependent claim. It covers the client's second example or second embodiment of figure 7 and so on, and it excludes the first embodiment. And this takes us to our last claim, which I have changed during the write-up. The original plan for claim 15 was to cover the parallel faces of the support members. And instead, I attempted to write a claim which covers, well, let's read the claim and we'll see. 15. The Nutcracker, according to any preceding claim, wherein the two support members, 1, 2, are located at two free ends of the Nutcracker, so as to be freely accessible from the two free ends for manually gripping the support members in two hands to move the support members in torsion or laterally relative to one another. So this is an attempt to cover the fact that you can pick up the device and you can operate it using your two hands from the opposite ends of the device. Now this distinguishes over D1's Nutcracker with the pivoted arms, and it distinguishes hopefully over D2's arrangement where the ends of the Nutcracker are not free for grasping the plates or the support members. So that was my attempt to put down that claim. Now, unfortunately, we're limited, or fortunately, we're limited to 15 claims in the EQE, and it's obvious that we could put down further claims. You may consult the examiner's reports for examples of further claims or the published example from the candidate. And so long as your set of claims covers useful embodiments as fallback positions, and so long as your set of claims is reasonably well organized, you will get good credit for your set of claims. So see the examiner's report for further possibilities. Now I would like to refer to the examiner's report for some comments on the claims, and mainly the main claim. Firstly, there are some general comments. These are generalities on the examiner's report. First, you should consult the examiner's report to check your own answer. However, you will notice that the examiner's report is mainly a listing of how you lose credit compared to the examiner's specimen claim, which covers the invention broadly and which would be awarded 50 marks for the main dependent claim. So the examiner's report is taking their claim as a zero base or the 50-mark baseline, and you lose marks according to how much you deviate from their claim. As the client instructs you to obtain the broadest possible protection complying with the European Patent Convention, theoretically your claim should approach the examiner's claim. However, as you approach the novel not novel boundary, the claim becomes very vulnerable to losing novelty or becoming unclear. In other words, as you approach the examiner's notional claim, you are in a very vulnerable position for losing a lot of credit. So as you don't have the examiner's report with you when you're doing the exam, and as you don't know exactly where they're drawing the line, it's dangerous to work at the brink of novelty, because this could be disastrous if you go wrong. Therefore, in my opinion, to avoid risks, you need to be sure that your claim is novel, and for this you may need to make some small concessions on the claim scope for the sake of safety. Let's now turn to the examiner's specimen claim, and then we'll turn to some specific points of marking. Here is the examiner's claim. Nutcracker, comprising two support elements 1, 2, at least three connecting elements 3, 5, 3, 6, each connecting element being attached to each of the support elements. The support elements and the connecting elements defining a space for receiving a nut. And then we have characterized in that each connecting element is movable with respect to each support element, such that a movement of one of the support elements relative to the other support element causes at least one of the connecting elements to move relative to another of the connecting elements, so that the space is restricted in order to crack a nut received in the space. According to the examiner's report, they considered that for this specimen claim, D1 would be considered more pertinent as the closest prior art than D2, as D1 is based on a lever effect. But the pre-characterizing part seems to cover both D1 and D2, and the examiners accept whether you choose D1 or D2 as closest prior art, depending upon your claim formulation. Note that the examiner's claim is devoid of any padding, in stark contrast to my claim, which is full of padding. Novelty of the examiner's claim depends on the very carefully worded characterizing part, and the novelty, in fact, boils down just to the relative movement as opposed of the connecting elements, as opposed to simple movement of the connecting elements. What I've done is I've rewritten the examiner's claim into two-part form, properly acknowledging, in my opinion, D2 as the closest prior art. Or was it D1? Sorry, D1 as the closest prior art. Here we have now the main claim has been I have rewritten it. I have changed the Nutcracker. The first two paragraphs, I've just compacted them together, but they're exactly the same as in the examiner's claim. So I'll read them again. Nutcracker comprising two support elements, at least three connecting elements, each connecting element being attached to each of the support elements and the connecting elements defining a space for receiving a nut. That was the original pre-characterizing part. Now I've put in a where-in clause where I've taken over a large fraction of the examiner's characterizing part, wherein each connecting element is movable with respect to each support element, such that a movement of one of the support elements relative to the other support element causes at least one of the connecting elements to move, so that the space is restricted in order to crack a nut received in the space. If you don't believe me that the pre-characterizing part is properly based upon D2, take a look at D1, I'm getting mixed up, D1. Take a look at D1 figures 3 and 4, and you will see that when the support elements move, the connecting elements also move, but they just don't move relative to one another. So I put in a characterizing clause which says, characterized in that, said the at least one connecting element is movable relative to another of the connecting elements to restrict the space. So that is how I think the claim could be rewritten. And you will see that the novelty is really very microscopic, because it just depends upon the words relative to. So within one or two words, your claim is going from novel to not novel. Therefore, the claim is extremely dangerous claim for a candidate to attempt, because you don't know how the examiners will react to this. So the moral is, as you don't have the examiner's report when you're drafting your claim, avoid, what I say, skating on thin ice with a claim at the brink of the novel, not novel boundary, and make sure that your claim is novel and inventive over the prior art. Now we're going to have a look at some zero penalty variations in relation to the examiner's specimen claim. Zero penalty variations means that if you write a claim with these variations, you will not lose any mark. You will get theoretically 50 marks if everything else is shipshape. So they begin by saying you can call it a nutcracker, or a device for cracking a nut, or a device for cracking nuts of different sizes, or you could just call it a device, and whichever wording you choose would not lose you any marks. Next point is they say that you could have two supports or two support elements. Support elements was the wording in the client's letter. You could call them just supports, or you could call them support members. And in fact, support members is the wording that I chose, because I thought that it was better to have a member for the support and an element for the connecting element, so there was less rise for confusion. Next feature is if you're providing you claim at least 3 connecting elements, or at least 3 connectors, or at least 3 elongated connecting elements, all that would be the same. Note that elongated connecting elements was in my claim, which is, I'm quite happy about that, but I put in further limitations about the narrowness of the connecting elements. So maybe my claim will be penalized for that. Then we have the connecting elements defining a space, a volume, or a cage for receiving a nut. And I've used the word space for receiving a nut, and that was the word used by the client in his letter. So you have different choices of terminology, and you can use this different terminology without losing any credit in the examiner's eyes. Then the examiners talk about each connecting element being movable, or being movably attached, or being rotatably attached, or pivotally attached by means of joints with respect to each support element. So here again, you have quite a choice of how you describe the connection. And in my claim, I use the word pivotally attached, which is one of the acceptable wordings given by the examiners, whereas in the examiner's claim, they were just movably attached, which is much more vague in a way. Let's continue on the next slide for further non-zero or zero penalty limitations. The next feature is a movement of one of the support elements relative to the other, or a relative movement of or between the support elements, providing you describe that in one way or another, there will be no penalty. And in my claim, I used a movement of one of the support elements relative to the others in the very finalized version of my claim, whereas I had a relative movement in the earlier versions of the claim. Then the examiners say causes one of the connecting elements to move relative to the other connecting element. The examiners made quite a thing about this in their report. Or it could be causes at least one of the connecting elements to move relative to the other connecting element. And if your claim implied that you had to, as a minimum, have two connecting elements moving, then that would be penalized. And last but not least, the zero penalty limitation, the support elements and or the connecting elements can be made of a stiff material, and you will notice that I included the stiff material in my claim, although I hesitated a long time whether to put it in or whether to leave it out. So you can see from the previous listing that you have flexibility in your choice of the claim wording, providing your claim is clear, providing the claim does not introduce any limitations that exclude from the claim scope either the client's embodiments or the described variations or any useful but non-described variations, and while the claim obviously has to remain novel and inventive. So the zero penalty limitation means you must aim for a claim which meets these criteria, and you have quite a lot of possibility to choose your terminology without losing any marks. Next, we will consider whether or not to claim inherent features, whether an inherent feature or feature should be claimed as essential or omitted as being inherent. It's sometimes difficult to know whether a feature should be claimed as essential or omitted as being inherent. An example is that the Nutcracker should be made of a stiff material as stated by the client. Stiffness was omitted from the examiner's specimen claim, which ends with a statement, "The space is restricted in order to crack a nut." As cracking a nut is a claim feature of the examiner's claim, it's inherent that the Nutcracker must be of stiff material, otherwise it wouldn't crack the nut. Stiffness is not essential to differentiate over the prior art, so it can be left out as inherent as the examiners left it out in their claim. On the other hand, in my claim and my draft claims, the Nutcracker was defined in terms of the features that lead to the result of cracking a nut, and the actual cracking of a nut was not included as a claimed feature. So I included the stiff material as essential in order to solve the problem of cracking a nut. So these inherent features are very difficult to handle, and I just advise you to try and find a balance between the examiner's preference to omit inherent essential features for maximum scope and conciseness and a cautious approach to include such features with a possible small loss of credit. I justify my cautious approach in that omission of a feature the examiners say in their report is essential may lead to a loss of 5 to 10 points. If the examiners turned around and said it was essential to claim the stiff material, you would lose 5 to 10 points. On the other hand, including an essential feature that could be regarded as inherent may lead to no penalty at all, which was the present case, or a very small penalty. So it's asymmetric. You lose more by leaving it out than you lose less by leaving it out than you lose by putting it in. Anyway, we turn to the major limitations that incur penalties according to the examiner's report, and this is on the next slide. Here are some of the major limitations that the examiners have identified. And it's important, obviously, that your main claim should not include any significant limitations that forfeit useful coverage. Here are the examples from the examiner's report. If you should claim that the support members are cubes, you lose 50 out of 50 points. You get 0 points for your claim because your claim has eliminated all of the client's examples. If you should limit your main claim to the support members being plates, this would cover the described examples, but it would not cover the described variations such as cubes, and you would lose 20 points. If you limited the claim by saying that the support members remain parallel to one another, you would lose 10 points. And this, I think, is due to the fact that if you carefully consider the figure 1 embodiment, as you twist the two support members, they do not necessarily remain parallel to one another. If you should limit the connecting elements to being tubes, you will eliminate coverage for all of the client's examples, and you will lose 50 points out of 50. You will get 0 points for your claim. If you limit the claim by saying that the connecting elements are rods, you lose 10 points. If you 10 point rods covers all of the embodiments, but it doesn't cover tubes or other variations. If you should put in that the connecting elements in your main claim are rods or tubes, this was not discussed in the examiner's report, but obviously you will lose some credit, and my guess is that you would lose 5 points if you limited to rods or tubes, but not any other possible connecting element. If you limited to the connecting elements being of the same length, you would cover the client's embodiments, but not the described variations, and you would lose 20 points. If you limited the main claim to having 3 to 5 connecting elements, in other words, you eliminate 6, you would lose 10 points. If you limited the main claim to ball joints, you would lose 30 points because you have limited to the first embodiment and excluded the second. Likewise, if you limited the main claim to hinges, you would lose 30 points because you cover the second embodiment but not the first. And if you limited to ball joints or hinges, you would also lose some points because you could have covered it by the general wording pivotally connected or something like that. And my guess is that you would lose 10 points. That was not discussed in the examiner's report. Good. So be careful when you check your claims. You must be sure that you don't exclude a described embodiment or a described variation, the examples being given above. Next, we'll discuss a broad but unallowable claim presented by the examiners. Here, the examiners give this claim. Maybe it came from a candidate, or maybe they invented it. Nutcracker based on lever effect and suitable for cracking walnuts and hazelnuts. Now, that claim covers all of the embodiments, but however, it is not a very clear claim, and the examiner said that the claim would be objected to as a mere wish, and it would lose 30 points. And in addition, you can lose points for lack of novelty. We'll see below. The claim does not comply with Rule 42 because it does not define the invention in terms of its technical features. A lever effect and suitable for cracking walnuts and hazelnuts are not technical features of the Nutcracker. The claim is dangerous in that it is based on an extrapolation of an inventive concept without having any regard to novelty. If you look at novelty, you look at D1's Nutcracker, which is based on a lever effect, and it could be regarded as suitable for cracking walnuts and hazelnuts, even though it does not do this in an optimal fashion, then the claim will lack novelty and you will lose an additional 20 points. So the claim will in fact get 0 points out of 50. The client requires broadest possible claim that meets all official requirements. So this is an example of a broad claim that does not meet all official requirements. Next, I'll discuss claiming a result. Result to be achieved. Claims defined in terms of a result to be achieved are generally objectionable. Consider the distinguishing feature of the examiner's proposed claim, which boils down to something which is a result or something which is very like a result, such that movement of one of the support elements relative to the other support element causes at least one of the connecting elements to move relative to the other of the connecting elements so that the space is restricted in order to crack a nut received in the space. Now, claiming a result is allowable. It comes in the guidelines F Roman 4 14 4.10 under result to be achieved. And the guidelines, if you read between the lines of the guidelines, the claiming a result will be acceptable if the wording preceding the construction of the result is framed as clearly as possible. So we can assume that the examiners have framed the preceding wording as clearly as possible, and their claim is not going to be criticized as claiming a result. But what you should realize is that the examiner's claim, again, is a borderline claim in this regard, and we only know from the examiner's report that they consider that this claim is to be accepted and not regarded as a mere result to be achieved. There again, we'll repeat it. If you're drafting as in the EQE, the examiner's report is not available to you. Consequently, it's dangerous to propose a borderline claim because you are unaware how the examiners would mark it. On the next, it's easy to draft a claim that inadvertently is not novel, by the way, and on the next slide I will present a claim that lacks novelty. So here's an example. Nutcracker comprising two support members connected by at least three elongated connecting elements. The connecting elements and the support members defining there between a space for receiving a nut. At least one of the support members being movable relative to the other support member to cause restriction of said space between the connecting elements and the support members. Now, that's very nicely written, and it corresponds more or less to the preamble of the examiners. But if you carefully consider it with D1, you will notice that the claim lacks novelty over D1. You will notice, if you compare it with D2, that the claim lacks novelty over D2, and a lack of novelty like this is going to mean a loss of 30 marks out of 50, so you get only 20 marks for your claim, which means that you're on your way to failing the EQE. Note, however, that this not novel claim is a generic claim that covers the client's embodiments. It covers all of the client's embodiments, and it covers also both prior art documents. On the other hand, a small restriction to make claim 1 securely novel could lead to a penalty of about 0 to 10 marks, which is less serious. Also, if you have an initial claim lacking novelty and you realize that it's lacking novelty, you may be able to recycle this claim by presenting it as a pre-characterizing part of a two-part claim completed with novelty conferring characterizing features. There is an example overleaf. Here is a possible characterizing clause that would salvage the previous not novel claim. So the pre-characterizing part is a previous claim, and then we have characterized in that each elongated connecting element, 345, 3456, is pivotally attached to the support members, such that relative movement of the support members causes a relative movement between the elongated connecting elements to restrict said space for receiving a nut. Now, this salvage claim is fairly close to the examiner's solution, and it's still a claim which is, so to say, in a dangerous situation. But once you have achieved novelty in your claim, you can work on it to improve the novelty and improve the clarity and to make sure that you cover all of the embodiments when you are reviewing the claim and when you are doing your dependent claims. Good. Let's now list some further possible losses as they are listed in the examiner's report. Lack of inventive step where the novelty conferring feature is trivial loses up to 25 marks. There were no particular examples of that. Lack of clarity loses up to minus 30 marks. And as I said before, lack of clarity seems to be judged on a sliding scale. If it's slightly unclear, you may lose 5 marks. If it's terribly unclear, you may lose 20 marks. If it's completely unclear, you may lose 30 marks. So clarity is judged on a sliding scale in the EQE. The examiners also mention what they call inferior solutions, where you may where you may gain a maximum of 20 marks. In other words, you may lose 20 or more marks. And an inferior solution will be a new and arguably inventive claim. And I think they mean the claim has to be novel, but where the inventive step is shaky, which has less favorable scope than the examiner's specimen independent claim, for example, going against the client's wishes, misses a key feature from the examiner's specimen independent claim, and has at least one feature that is not in the examiner's specimen independent claim. And my claim may fall in the latter category, but it doesn't really, my claim is not really arguably inventive. I think we'll see that we have established inventive step quite satisfactorily, so maybe we don't have a problem there. And on formal matters, wrong two-part claim or no reference signs, you lose up to 5 marks for this. So if you put your characterizing in the wrong place, and if you leave out reference signs, you may lose 5 marks on your claim. Note that if we consider the previous sheets, all in all, there is a potential for losing all credit for the main claim, but you can't go below 0, just as you can't go above 50. So however bad your claim is, however many mistakes you make, you will never get less than 50 marks. And however brilliant your claim is, you will never get more than 50 marks. You will notice that my claim hopefully avoids all of the major losses, but accumulates several small or zero penalty limitations. One of the reasons you should concentrate on the main independent claim is that the loss of credit on the main claim can be dramatic if you make some mistakes. So if you have some small limitations in the claim, it's not going to be tragic so long as you don't have major limitations. Let's now leave the main independent claim and briefly consider the criteria for acceptable dependent claims. You can pick up good marks with a well-organized and structured set of dependent claims, just as you can lose a lot of the credit available by poor organization and poor structure. So you should compare your claim set with the examiner's feature set, the examiner's example set of claims, and those of the published candidate, and perhaps also my set of claims, just to get an idea for claim organization and structure, and so on. You need to get some practice in organizing your claim sets so that you can write them up in one go. Now, let's see, I'm lost here. Dependent claims. Okay, I'm going to go now down through the criteria noted on this slide. Maximum 35 points. The claim structure should give an appropriate set of fallback options. The allowable content of the dependent claims depends on the wording of the main independent claim. So if you have a different wording for your independent claim, that may influence the possibilities you have for your set of dependent claims. Clarity, consistency, and conciseness are important for the dependent claims. Having correct claim dependencies is important so that you don't inadvertently lose protection, especially no unnecessary loss by combinations of inadequate dependencies. Dependent claims should be generalized as far as possible with no unnecessary limitations and no trivial dependent claims. So we've seen before, if you organize your claims well and the claims are of adequate scope, you should get reasonable marks on your dependent claims. Now I'll turn to the introduction to the description. Here is some theory for the introduction to the description. You can write up the introduction based on your votum for grant notes that we discussed in part 2 of the tutorial. As you go along, you can bulk out the notes. As you go along, you should refer to the source documents, which are D1 and D2 and Claim 1, and incorporate the necessary facts from them. And you should, above all, follow the sequence of Rule 42.1 A, B, and C, so your introduction is written in the prescribed format. Note that if you do the introduction to the description as the very last operation, you may have to work very efficiently to finish in time, and therefore you may need to do some practicing in writing up sets of claims quickly. So practice writing up an introduction in compliance with Rule 42 at work and in your exam preparations. Let's now see my example of an introduction to the description based on my example claims. The introduction starts by saying, this invention relates to nutcrackers. This is the field of the invention, Rule 42.1a. It continues, D1 describes a nutcracker comprising two spaced apart lever arms, pivotally connected, and so on. And this is now the description of the background art, Rule 42.1b. So connected at one end by connecting spacing elements that are fixed relative to one another, when a nut is placed between the arms and cracked by pivoting together the two arms. This nutcracker has the drawback that to optimally crack both large nuts such as walnuts and small nuts such as hazelnuts, it has to be modified by fitting connecting spacing elements of different dimensions. Note that D1 is not the closest prior art for my presented claim. I've not taken this for the claim preamble. I've nevertheless discussed it because I think it was useful to discuss D1. And note that my discussion of D1 contrasts as far as possible with the client's invention. The arms are pivoted, and so on and so forth. By pivoting together, I've talked about spacing, connecting spacing elements, because I wanted to say that the spacing elements has to be modified to accommodate for different sizes of nuts. So it ends up then with a drawback of D1. And that's fine. If you've discussed D1 in your introduction, you may want to compare it. It could be quite different to what I've said and still be a very good description. Next comes D2, and we're still talking background art. 42.1, it should be 42.1b on the slide. We're continuing. First, we state that D2 describes a nutcracker that corresponds to the pre-characterizing part of Claim 1. Let's put this to the test by going through the pre-characterizing part of Claim 1 and by comparing it with D2 that we have there. A nutcracker comprising two support members. These are what are they called? I can't remember the name of them, the plates of a stiff material connected in spaced relationship by at least three elongated connecting elements, which are the rods, that are also a stiff material and are narrow. At least one of the support members being movable relative to the other support member. They are the support members are movable relative to one another. The two support members facing one another, at least when the support members are in a rest position of the Nutcracker, that condition is complied with. The elongated connecting elements being attached to each support member, so the elongated connecting elements are spaced apart laterally from one another between the support members and are distributed around a space for receiving a nut. That applies also to the rods of D1. So D2, excuse me. So D2 does indeed correspond to the pre-characterizing part. So that is our closest prior art for the for the analysis of inventive step. Note that the pre-characterizing part of Claim 1 is a definition which covers the client's invention, and at the same time it also covers the closest prior art, which in this case is D2. Next follows a description of D2 in terms which contrast as far as possible with the client's Nutcracker. Let's read it. This Nutcracker, D2's Nutcracker, comprises two spaced apart blocks, slidably mounted on parallel rods, which are connected at their opposite ends by rigid strips with attached pull rings. By placing a nut between the rods and the two blocks and pulling the pull rings apart abruptly, the two blocks are moved together to squeeze and crush the nut. And I've added at the end a statement which comes from the client's letter. This Nutcracker is suitable for cracking both large nuts such as walnuts and small nuts such as hazelnuts, but skill is needed to crack nuts without crushing them, which is the statement of the problem that we have. It sets up the problem by describing the disadvantage of the prior art. Next will come the problem and solution presentation of the invention. I've set out the problem in accordance with Rule 42.1c, disclosure of the invention in terms of an object of the invention. An object of the invention is a way of setting up the problem, and I've expressed it as follows. An object of this invention is to provide a nutcracker which is suitable for cracking both large nuts such as walnuts and small nuts such as hazelnuts, while being easy to manipulate with low applied strength. So that then corresponds to Rule 42.1c, disclose the invention as claimed in such terms that the technical problem and its solution, that is a technical problem, can be understood. Please note that when you set up your problem, the problem can be set up in different ways. The objective problem is rather subjective because it can be expressed in different ways by different people, and you have to find your own way of expressing the objective problem in such a way as to support the inventive step here or to challenge inventive step in paper C. And I've just given an example of what you should not do in expressing the problem. So I've said here, the statement of the problem should never contain a pointer to the solution. For example, you should not say, an object of the invention is to provide a nutcracker that cracks nuts by restricting the space between the elongated connecting elements. That is putting the solution into the problem, and you should not do that. Next comes the statement of invention. The disclosure of the invention, Rule 42.1c, continues, and I have let's read my introduction. The invention achieves this in that the two support members are maintained spaced apart from one another by being pivotally attached to spaced apart parts of each elongated connecting element, typically at or near their ends. With this arrangement, relative movement of the support members away from the rest position causes a relative movement between the elongated connecting elements to progressively restrict the space in which a nut to be cracked is received. Now, this is in effect a recitation of Claim 1's characterizing clause, written in narrative form in several sentences and interjecting things like typically at or near their ends. So you can always, it's quite good style when you're putting forward the statement of invention in the exam conditions is to recite the claim but not to put it in verbally. On the other hand, if you're really in a hurry at this point of your writing, you could, instead of writing up the claim characterizing part completely, especially if it's long, you could just say the invention achieves this by the characterizing features of claim 1. Okay, we continue with the Rule 42.1c. Ends by saying that you should describe any advantageous effects, and here is my example of trying to explain the advantageous effects of the invention. This results in a progressive and easily controlled squeezing of the nut by a lever effect that minimizes the applied strength to crack a nut, so the nutcracker is easy to manipulate. The inventive nutcracker, I continue, can be made with dimensions, notably the spacing of the connecting elements, such that both large nuts like walnuts and small nuts like hazelnuts can be reliably cracked. This is an important part of the discussion where we're explaining how the invention has solved the problem, and we need to further elaborate on how it can cope with small and large nuts. So we'll go to the next slide. And it explains the largest nuts to be cracked can be inserted and held between the connecting elements when the nutcracker is in the rest position. Smaller nuts can be inserted and held between the connecting elements by moving the supportive elements away from the nutcracker's rest position to slightly restrict the nut receiving space. And then it says, thereafter, the support elements are moved further away from the rest position until the large or small nut is cracked by lever effect in a controlled manner. And it's the last words which are really related to the problem that we have set up. So this is very much in harmony with the problem to be solved. The explanation is harmonious with the claim and so on. Okay, overleaf are some further notes. Further notes from the examiner's report. According to the examiner's report, the main claim can be written as a two-part claim taking D1 or D2 as closest prior art, or as a one-part claim. So this leaves you with the greatest flexibility to present the claim structure depending upon how you perceive the invention and the prior art. However, whatever structure you choose, the claim scope should be more or less the same, whatever claim structure you choose. Note that if you choose a one-part claim, you must discuss both prior art documents D1 and D2 in the introduction to the description, and you have to make it clear how the claim differentiates over each document. If you choose a two-part claim, this is the next slide, you must discuss the closest prior art D2 or D1 in the introduction. As you'll notice, I chose D2 as the closest prior art, but I discussed both D1 and D2. If you choose a two-part claim with D1 as closest prior art, the pivoted connection of the connecting elements would have to go in the pre-characterizing part, and the fact that the two support members are pivoted towards the opposite ends of the connecting elements would be in the characterizing part, for example, possibly with the definition that the nut receiving space is defined between spaced apart connecting elements. So if you're going to do your claim based upon D1, your claim can have a completely different structure than if it's based upon D2. In any event, the claim structure has little influence on the marks awarded. You can lose 3 points for an incorrect two-part division. Now I'd like to have a look at the official marking, or the marking table. My unofficial version of the marking table. On the left hand, I've put the marks for the main claim, dependent claim, introduction, and total, and in the 3 columns I put the maximum mark available, a mark you should aim for or you would get if you pass, and a mark that you may have if you fail the exam. So there are 50 points maximum for the main claim, and if you're aiming to pass the drafting paper, you should get 25 to 40 or even more points out of 50 for the main claim. Definitely not less than 25 points if you want to pass the A paper. If you get less than 15 points or less than 20 points on the main claim, it is pretty certain that you will fail the A paper. This is why I said it's so important that you have to concentrate on the main claim, because there are so many ways you can lose marks on the main claim. For the dependent claims, the maximum mark is 35, and I said if you're aiming to pass, you should expect or hope to get 20 to 30 points out of 35 on the dependent claims. It's difficult to get full marks on the dependent claims because that requires a very perfect organization and scope of the claim. But if you get between 20 and 30 marks on the dependent claims, together with your marks on the main claim, you are on the way to passing the exam. On the other hand, if you get less than 15 or less than 20 on the dependent claims, you're going to fail the exam pretty for sure. For the introduction to the description, there is a maximum of 15 points to be obtained. It's quite difficult to obtain 15 points, but if you're aiming to pass, you can get between 8 and 12 points for the description if you follow the prescribed sequence. You write down something clear, your claim is okay. On the other hand, if you get 4 to 8 points on the introduction, that is a path to failure. So for the total marks is 100 marks. You can't get above 50, you can't get above 35, you can't get above 15 for the 3 categories, and you can't get below 0 for any of the categories. So if you add up the marks that I've given, the lowest end and the highest end, you're getting between 53 and 82 marks for your A paper, which is 82 marks is quite good going, but you can do even better than that by getting more marks on the main claim. If you get below 25 and below 20, so if you have 20 on the main claim, even if you get 20 on the dependent claims and 8 on the introduction, which is quite good, you get 48 points maximum, which is a compensable fail. But usually if you get low marks on the main claim, you get also low marks on the dependent claims and the low marks on the introduction, and you're more likely to be at the 34 level or even less if your main claim was not very, very good. So you can see from the examiner's reports that below 0 marks deductions are possible, but they're not allowed to deduct below 0. But if you get 0 on any category, you're going to fail the exam. The sort of marks I put down aim passes for a comfortable pass is about 60 to 70 marks on the A paper, and that is what you should be aiming for. Now I'd like to turn to the influence of the drafting paper A on papers B, C, and D of the EQE. EQE drafting provides good grounding, in my opinion, as a basis for your work on the other exam papers. In the EQE drafting, we naturally make full use of the facts supplied by the client that make up his invention and the prior art. In other words, the drafting paper is a very factful paper. In drafting claims, we assemble the given facts to achieve legal consequences, which are clarity, novelty, and inventive step. This is the operation we have been doing during the tutorial. In drafting the introduction, we assemble the facts in compliance with Rule 42. So drafting paper then involves selection and presentation of facts to produce the given legal consequences of novelty, inventive step, and clarity. In papers B, C, and D, all of these papers involve making arguments. Arguments are very highly marked in paper B and paper C. Arguments in the context of the EQE, we can consider that arguments are presentations of facts in support of legal consequences, which is exactly what we've been doing in paper A. However, when we're making arguments, especially arguing for the lack of inventive step of a claim in paper C, it's all too easy to neglect the facts and substitute the facts with unsubstantiated assertions. So drafting for paper A introduces you to the power of factual presentations and sets you on the way to develop convincing arguments based on the facts for the other papers of the exam. Next, I'll just have a few words to say about adjusting your working habits to EQE drafting conditions. You should try and make the most of your work experience as EQE preparation. So make the most of your work for EQE preparation. To do this, you can proceed as follows. Avoid spreading out your drafting operations over several days or weeks. In the EQE, you have to draft the claims and introduction in a short period of several hours, and it's counterproductive if during your work you're spreading the operation up over several days. Try to always draft your main independent claim as a separate operation with several revisions before you go ahead with other aspects, such as drafting the dependent claims or the introduction. Always strip off unnecessary limitations from your claims and always make a conscious novelty check whether your claim is novel compared to the prior art that you have in front of you. Try and develop your sets of claims as a one-off operation, keeping to 15 claims where possible, which is quite usual now for many clients, and avoid trivial subclaims. Draft your introduction to the description at work in compact EPC EQE format using only the closest prior art, and if you need to put in further prior art, add that as a do your description with the closest prior art to begin with, complete your description, and then add secondary prior art as a separate operation later. If you adjust your working habits along these lines, drafting under EQE conditions should come as less of a shock. After all, aiming for a broad and valid claim is common to EQE practice and everyday requirements. This brings our three-part tutorial on EQE Paper A to an end. If you're interested in developing your drafting long-term, I would like to recommend the book Drafting and Amendment of European Patents, available from shopmybooks.com. Key in Drafting and Amendment in the dialog box. This book, Drafting and Amendment of European Patents, is a comprehensive analysis of drafting, mainly from the perspective of on-the-job drafting of European patents, but it also makes extensive references to EQE drafting with a view to obtaining broad and valid coverage. Please look out also on the PatSkills blogspot for forthcoming tutorials on other papers of the EQE. Now some closing words. This brings our tutorial on drafting EQE Paper A to an end. I hope it has been of value to you both in your preparations for the exam and for your everyday drafting in the office, where you can put into practice what you learn in your exam preparations. Be on the lookout for upcoming tutorials on other EQE subjects, as I mentioned, will be announced on the PatSkills blogspot. For further guidance on EQE preparation, you can, and I recommend that you do consult the book EQE Comprehensive, available from shopmybooks.com. Search word PatSkills. À bientôt.